The South African history of ANC and MK in exile in Zimbabwe, Part 2. The Wankie and Sipolilo campaigns, clashes in Wankie. The cooperation between the two movements simulated in the launch of the Wankie and Sipolilo campaigns in 1967 to 68. In early 1967, MK cadres were moved from military training camps in Tanzania to Zambia. That same year, ZIPRA and MK carried out joint reconnaissance missions to identify entry points into Rhodesia, hideouts and sites to store arms caches. Between 30 and 31st July 1980, 80 members of the Lutuli detachment crossed the Zambezi into southern Rhodesia. The group was split into two. One group was to head to South Africa to establish bases, while the other would remain in southern Rhodesia to support MK cadres that would follow. The move would also avoid stretching the supply lines. Once inside the country, they faced unfamiliar terrain, resulting in cadres losing contact with each other, as even ZIPRA cadres were lost familiar with the Wankie area and running out of supplies. Rhodesian forces received intelligence about the presence of guerrillas in the Wankie area and stepped up patrols. On 13 August, clashes occurred between the Rhodesian forces and one of the detachments on banks of the Nyatwe River. 2 white officers, 2 African soldiers and 5 guerrillas were killed. In this clash, the British South Africa Police BSAP fled and returned with reinforcements to retrieve the bodies of the dead officers. Between 21st August and September, a second and third round of battles broke out. Another detachment was spotted by Rhodesian security forces, leading to the death of more cadres and Rhodesian security forces. With ammunition and supplies running low and the supplies route cut by the Rhodesian and South African forces, the group fled to Botswana, where its members were promptly arrested. After serving their sentences in Botswana, they were deported to Zambia. Clashes at Sipolilo. When the news of the Lutuli department and the difficulties they were facing reached Lusaka, a decision was made to send another unit to southern Rhodesia to divert the attention of the security forces away from the Wankie unit. The Pyramid Detachment was constituted and tasked with opening up the Eastern Front to open a second route to South Africa. The detachment was made up of 74 ZIPRA and 32 MK cadres under the command of Moffat Hadebe from ZIPRA. 3 groups of MK and ZIPRA forces crossed the Zambezi River into southern Rhodesia on 29 December 1967, assisted by Boston Gagarin, who enabled the cadres to carry arms and ammunition across the river. More fighters crossed in February and another group followed in July 1968. Guerrillas initially set up camps and survived for 3 months, but food supplies began to run out and some of the communication equipment broke down. The Rhodesian security forces detected the presence of military activity in the area and clashes broke out as early as March, leaving casualties on both sides. The clashes between Rhodesian forces and the Pyramid Detachment lasted from March to July 1968. Some guerrillas retreated to Zambia, while 23 were killed and others were captured. Several members of MK were captured and sentenced to lengthy prison terms at Kami prison on the outskirts of Bulawayo. When Zimbabwe became independent in 1980, MK and ZIPRA members imprisoned since their capture in the Wankie and Sipolilo campaigns were released. post-independence cooperation between ANC and ZANU. The ANC hoped that ZAPU would win the 1980s elections, but it was the Zimbabwe African National Union Patriotic Front ZANU-PF that won. As the TRC report pointed out, the ZAPU victory was considered the worst-case scenario for the apartheid government. Thus, after independence, the ANC had to establish a relationship with ZANU-PF. The relationship was acrimonious at the beginning because of tension between ZANU and ZAPU, the latter having been the ally of MK. Reddy Mampane points out that in 1985, after he was appointed as the ANC's chief representative in Zimbabwe, ZANU still regarded the ANC with suspicion, in his case especially when he was seen with people from ZAPU. This was because of disturbances in Matabele land and Midlands at the time. Oliver Tambo and Thabo Mbeki facilitated the building of the ANC's relationship with the newly established government of Zimbabwe. By 1986, MK had reached an agreement with Zimbabwe on its clandestine activities in the country. The government would allow a limited flow of MK weapons and military personnel into the country on the condition that it was kept informed. Joe Modise, the commander of MK, met with Solomon Mujuru, Rex Nongo, commander of the Zimbabwe National Army, to discuss how MK could be assisted in crossing the border into South Africa. Cross-border raids, destabilization efforts, and economic sabotage. The ANC formally established its presence in Zimbabwe by appointing Joe Qabi as the party's chief representative in Harare. Several cadres of MK and the ANC, Penuel Maduna, Geraldine Fraser Moleketi, and Derek Andre Honeycomb, among others, lived in exile in Zimbabwe. This stirred the apartheid government into action, and it conducted targeted assassinations on ANC activists in Zimbabwe. On 24 February 1981, a bomb was discovered in the car of the ANC's chief representative in Harare, Joe Qabi. Despite this failed assassination attempt, the agents of the apartheid government ambushed and shot Qabi 19 times on 31 July 1981 as he reversed down the driveway on his Harare home. Pretoria took advantage of the tensions brewing in the post-independent military integration process in Zimbabwe. When former ZIPRA and ZINLA cadres clashed in military bases, some armed ZIPRA cadres deserted the army, leading to a government crackdown. Some disgruntled members of ZIPRA were recruited by the South African government towards the end of 1982. Super ZAPU, as they became known, received training, arms and ammunition from Pretoria and continued to operate in areas of Matabele land. Also incorporated into this rebel movement were former members of the Silas Scouts, a multiracial military unit established by the Rhodesian government. Several members of this unit crossed into South Africa after the 1980 elections and joined special units of the apartheid government security forces. After various military attacks and formal complaints laid by the Zimbabwean government, the group began collapsing around 1984. Thus, just as the apartheid government sponsored armed groups for destabilization, such as the Mozambican National Resistance Renamo in Mozambique, UNITA in Angola, and the Lesotho Liberation Army LLA in Lesotho, Super ZAPU was established to destabilize Zimbabwe. In May 1987, Tsitsi Chiliza, A Zimbabwean citizen married to an ANC member was killed by a booby-trapped television set intended for Jacob Zuma. Later, in October of the same year, Jeremy Blackhill, a ZAPU member married the ANC Joan Freeman, was severely crippled in a bomb blast that injured 17 other people in a shopping complex in Harare. Also in 1987, Leslie Lesia was arrested in Zimbabwe in possession of a small bottle of poison given to him by the SADF's Department of Military Intelligence to poison ANC members and officials. Around February 1987, Odile Harrington, a South African military intelligence agent, was sent to infiltrate the ANC in Zimbabwe and send back plans of the ANC officers in Harare. She was arrested and detained of the ANC officers in Harare. She was arrested and detained before finally standing trial in November 1987. She was sentenced to 25 years in jail, but her sentence was reduced on appeal. In January 1988, a car bomb injured 3 ANC members in Bulawayo. Then in November 1988, Kevin Woods, Michael Smith, and Philip Konjwayo, former members of the Rhodesian Intelligence and Security Forces recruited by the Southern African Intelligence Service after 1980 to carry out destabilization activities in Zimbabwe, killed a driver carrying a bomb intended for the ANC officers. Several members of the ANC were injured in the blast. They were subsequently arrested and sentenced to death, but their sentences were later commuted to life imprisonment by the Supreme Court. All 3 were released in 2006 by the Zimbabwean government on humanitarian grounds. More attacks followed. The ANC office in Harare was hit by a rocket, and in April 1990, Michael Lapsley, an Anglican priest and member of the ANC, was seriously injured by a later bomb sent to him in Harare. Over and above the targeted bombings in Harare by the apartheid security forces, the South African government used Renamo to sabotage Zimbabwe economically. When Mozambique became independent in 1978, it closed its borders within South Rhodesia a year later, forcing Southern Rhodesia to send its goods and service through South Africa. When Rhodesia became independent as Zimbabwe in 1980, the trade route through Mozambique was re-established and the route through South Africa was abandoned. South Africa retaliated by withholding goods destined for Zimbabwe and embarking on an economic destabilization campaign. In November 1980, more than 50,000 tons of Zimbabwean goods were held at South African ports, deliberately kept from reaching their destination. Then in 1981, 300,000 tons of the country's goods, including 3 shipments of fertilizer, was withheld by South Africa. That same year, South African Railway SAR announced that it was terminating its trade agreements with the National Railways in Zimbabwe, NRZ, and demanded the return of 24 diesel locomotives leased to the NRZ under the Rhodesian government. In more naked aggression, South African-funded Renamo blew up bridges and the railway line connecting Zimbabwe to Mozambican coast, leading to the deployment of Zimbabwean troops to guard the line. All these were attempts by the apartheid regime to use its economic power to try and bludgeon Zimbabwe into political and diplomatic concessions. Mlambo and raid on Korongosa, Zimbabwe's military involvement in Mozambique, 1982 to 1992. The championed geopolitical system which saw the collapse of the Soviet Union and pressure on the apartheid government by increasing internal unrest and international sanctions set the stage for the negotiated settlement. The ANC sponsored a document that laid down key milestones for the creation of the climate for negotiations and lobbied for it to be adopted by the frontline states, the Organization of Africa Union (OAU), the United Nations (UN), and the non-aligned movement. On 21 August 1989, frontline states, the OAU, ANC, the South Africa government, and the religious figures held a summit in Harare, and the document, henceforth known as the Harare Declaration, was adopted. This paved way for negotiations which resulted in the dismantling of apartheid and the first all-inclusive democratic elections in 1994. Stay tuned for the next continuation video. And that's it from Injibs Network. Stay tuned to our celebrity and gossip news.